wondered about transcendence, a sense of existence or experience beyond the self. Transcendence is a driving motivation of closer to truth. Each of our pillar categories, cosmos, consciousness, meaning, goes beyond the self. What is it about transcendence that so intrigues us? Well, first, how is transcendence elicited? Religious experience, psychedelics, emotional high, creative high, runner's high? Transcendence is an expression, an intense expression of the mind. My lifelong passion is to understand the mind. Neuroscience, cognitive science, psychology, philosophy, these have been my ways for understanding. In recent years, Closer to Truth has been assessing art as a fresh way for understanding mind and meaning. So, since art can help us understand mind, and transcendence is an expression of mind, can art help us understand transcendence? Can we explore transcendence via art and mind? I'm Robert Lawrence Kuhn, and Closer to Truth is my journey to find out. To assess whether, and perhaps how, art can help us understand transcendence, I need to assess linkages between mind, art, and transcendence. I hear of a conference on art seeking understanding, a long-term project of the Templeton Religion Trust. It's in Edinburgh, Scotland, so that's where I go. Attending are neuroscientists, cognitive scientists, social scientists, philosophers, art critics, theologians, all focusing on what is it about art that can bring about transcendence. I should start by framing transcendence. I meet the director of the Cambridge Body, Mind, and Behavior Laboratory, experimental social psychologist, Simone Schnall. Simone, the process from understanding the mind, then bringing in art as a modality, and then looking for transcendence as a goal. How do you reflect on that transformation?
We all lived through a pandemic, deaths, millions of deaths around the world and so on. Something that has affected every single person on the planet. One thing to come out of it could actually perhaps be positive in the sense that it has refocused people thinking about, well, what matters in life? The appreciation that life is short. And how are you going to live a life? A good life. So then what are good ways of getting people to engage with these questions in the right way? Well, perhaps these kinds of aesthetic experiences we've been exploring, a sense of beauty, a sense of being captivated by something that is greater than you are, that's more important than you are as a person.
This transition from mind to art to transcendence, is this a circular kind of path that art kind of acts as this trigger or this facilitator that gets mind to transcendence, and then with the transcendence we can better understand the mind?
I think that's a very interesting idea. You mentioned the mind. So what we're looking at is in terms of thinking, cognitive processes, and so on. But if one goes beyond that, well, why do we have a mind? I mean, based on evolution, human beings have evolved to do a lot of thinking because it was useful in some way, and typically it encourages appropriate action, appropriate behavior. So then the question is, in this context, well, what do people do as a consequence? Are these aesthetic experiences just influencing the mind and what people do when they sit around and think and talk? Or does it actually compel them to act in different ways?
If we were sitting here, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years from today, looking back on our explorations of mind, art, and transcendence, what would be findings or results that we could discuss?
Maybe we could get rid of the term art and just replace it with something that's more democratic, perhaps, or more engaging, to think of it as an experience that just happens to be one instantiation of aesthetic appreciation, of a certain qualitative experience that we might have of different kinds across everyday life all the time. Let's open up these kinds of experience to the widest number of people possible, and perhaps the research can contribute to say that, well, this is really something that's worth doing.
So what would be the kind of research that would give you confidence to say that?
Well, one would have to show that appreciating art is similar in terms of the outcomes as, let's say, appreciating beautiful nature, beautiful landscape. Churches, in fact, are perfect examples of beauty, of environments that feel very special on an emotional level, visceral level, perhaps even. And to say that, well, all these things have in common that they engage the person, they engage their minds in ways that maybe can be cultivated in a museum when you put up famous paintings, but could also be cultivated in many different ways.
To Simone, that disruption and death can elicit reflection on the larger questions of life is itself a kind of transcendence. And other such reflections, such as on beauty and on meaning beyond the self, collectively compose the essence of transcendence. Is this an opening for art? That churches exemplify strikingly beautiful environments elicits wonder. What makes spaces sacred? I ask an architect who studies sacred spaces and spirituality through the lens of phenomenology and the discoveries of neuroscience, Julio Bermudez.
I see architecture and the arts as fundamental tools that humanity developed to assist in the apparently impossible task of engaging the metaphysical. So here you have the most physical of all the artifacts that humanity have created, buildings, that function as bridges to engage the most metaphysical, the most esoteric, the most immaterial, ethereal component, and yet the miracle is possible. So to me, it's fascinating how to do it, and I think that's really the task of architecture and the arts.
What are some specific examples of how that works?
We could look at the aesthetic nature of architecture, for instance, of the arts, that because of its incredible, compelling symmetry or composition, of materialization, of craftsmanship, or scale, or the capacity of reverberating music, for instance, to enter in this absorption, this transcending, inviting condition in which we forget ourselves and we enter in this special relationship. When you look at the human condition, one of the things we face immediately is a question of death and the question of how we make meaning in this world. When we figure something out or we find some explanation, what we want to do is to transfer or communicate that to our fellow human beings. So we do that in architecture and the art. This is how we find signification of your life, our life. This is how we explain death. This is how we find meaning in this otherwise existentially challenging life.
And you're doing that through architecture.
Yes. These are pointers. These are pointers to the ultimate question of humanity. So architecture is creating an artificial environment, a construct that through its layout, through its materiality, through its engaging of light and more, invite us to states of mind that make us forget ourselves and enter in relation to something transcendental.
It might seem counterintuitive. The most physical of human artifacts, buildings, function as bridges to engage and communicate the most metaphysical, the most esoteric of human thought, the transcendental. But why does such physicality reveal the transcendent, not limit it? The answer must lie in the deep nature of the human mind, the nexus of transcendence, art, and mind. How then to use art and mind to enrich understanding of the transcendent? A traditional way, but not the only way, is with theology. I ask an expert in theology and the arts, Judith Wolfe.
I suppose there are two directions from which one could approach the question of mind, art, and transcendence. One, from the perspective of reality and transcendent reality, if there is such a thing, and how it might manifest itself through art to the mind. And then, of course, the opposite direction, in which we investigate what the structures of our mind are that may or may not be necessary to engage with transcendence, if there is such a thing, or if we're pessimistic, which throw up the illusion of transcendence even when there isn't any.
And how art is a vehicle to intervene in that and intensify that process.
Exactly. So my work is much more interested in the ways in which art both probes and cultivates structures and habits of our mind which are relevant to the question of what we experience as transcendence. And I'm perfectly open to both outcomes that we find through our investigation of mind and art, that transcendence is an illusion that's habitually thrown up by the mind, or that there really are capacities of our mind that are opened by art to something that might manifest itself to us.
Is there any way that you can adjudicate between those two positions?
I don't think that from within the structures of our mind we can adjudicate between those two. And that is in some sense an important concept in my work. And my sense is that our engagement with even a felt presence of God or a sense of the divine always functions through our ordinary processes of mind, including our imagination, our desire, and so forth, and that they're valenced differently for us. That when we imagine the presence of God, we are imagining it in such a way, not that, we're inhabiting Middle Earth imaginatively or talking to an imaginary friend that we know not to be real, but that these processes are responding to something that's out there. But obviously we can't know from within ourselves whether we're responding to something out there, whether that is there, because the processes are the same as in projection. And so we need other ways of investigating
And so therefore, what can art tell us about transcendence?
I think art is a wonderful middle thing that both makes us conscious of our own imaginative or projective investment in what we're seeing, because art always gives us incomplete or incongruous information that we invest with our own memories, with our own meanings, with our own desires, and so forth. But on the other hand, art is also something that's intentionally created by an artist with a vision that will often expand our understanding of the connection between things, the meaning of things. It will give us a greater depth of perception than we could achieve by ourselves. And so it does bring something to us, but it also elicits something from us. And it can therefore serve as a testing ground for both of those directions, in a sense. The knotty question of the strict separation or not between material and immaterial aspects of reality is something that art precisely speaks to, because very often, particularly in, let's say, modern expressionist art, we are confronted with a series of lines that do not make sense on the purely material plane. Think of Picasso's Weeping Woman, which has these strange contortions. Literal plane only makes sense by a certain perception of depth. This woman appears broken because she is broken on the inside. In other words, art, particularly that kind of art, pushes us from an incongruity on the material level to a depth perception. And that's precisely what theology often does. It sees incongruities in ordinary material life. For example, the inevitability of death and the ineradicable desire of love that life should be eternal. Then it may well be that incongruity has to be resolved on a deeper level.
Judith approaches mind, art, transcendence from two directions. Transcendence as deeper reality reflecting a supreme being, or transcendence as illusion reflecting evolutionary adaptation, nothing beyond the physical. Either way, art is a probe. That's why a Christian perspective should not be my only one. What's the Islamic perspective? I ask an expert in the philosophy and art of Islamic and indigenous traditions of West and North Africa, Oludamini Ogunnaike. When you hear the terms mind, art, transcendence, what do you think?
I kind of immediately convert it and translate it into my head into Arabic as aql, or intellect. Art I translate just as beauty, jamal, and transcendence I translate as jalal, divine majesty. And so what I think about are the ways in which these different aspects of reality interpenetrate each other, affect each other, and ultimately illuminate each other.
And what is the causative pathway among the three?
I see them as all mutually intercausing each other. So art illuminates our minds, but art also comes from our minds, from our hearts, from our intelligence. The transcendence is, in a certain sense, that from which all of us come, that from which all of us return. Transcendence is what our intellects are always striving to grasp, and that in that grasping we produce beautiful things. The highest art in the Islamic tradition, the most beautiful thing, is the beauty of the human soul, the cultivation of the beauty of character of the human soul. And that is pursued when we pursue transcendence. Ultimately, within the Sufi tradition, transcendence, mind, and art all name the same reality. They all come from the same reality, and they all go back to the same reality. They're just kind of different ways of looking at and understanding this reality. So,
and by understanding these three ideas in parallel, does that give you a richer understanding of what they are?
Absolutely. Understanding the human being's relationship to transcendence, not just transcendence as a concept created by human beings, but something which transcends conceptual constructions is something that's very important. Art very much helps us do that. But then, in a certain sense, within the Islamic tradition in general, all of creation is divine art. All of creation is that which comes forth from the transcendent, expressing itself, transcending its transcendence. Quran calls God the creator and the former, the one who shapes forms. So all of creation, including ourselves, are works of divine art. And the highest art is our own cultivation of our character, because we're kind of like mirrors, according to the Islamic tradition. We're the only things in creation that can reflect all of the names and qualities of the divine reality.
In Islam, mind, art, transcendent are three aspects of the one reality that interpenetrate, intercause, and illuminate one another. Given Islam's theological worldview, such ultimate unity makes sense because mind, art, transcendent are created by the one God, Allah. In contrast, a scientific worldview teases them apart. How does art reveal transcendence? How does mind generate transcendence? I've been focusing on the visual arts. Could the oral arts, music, provide different insights? I ask a classical composer who conducts scientific research on the nature of musical cognition, Jonathan Berger.
Music, as opposed to the other arts, is inherently abstract. That inherent abstraction and the fact that it's a temporal art, it's in your mind and it's out of your mind, and you're processing it as it comes, makes it a unique laboratory for understanding how the mind is processing in terms of building expectations, in terms of affective response to sound. For me, it always splits into this world of what's innate and universal and what's culturally bound. Okay. And so there are aspects of music that are universally affective. The sound of a baby screaming or the sound of a baby cooing. One is consonant and one is dissonant, but there are also the sounds themselves are sensorially consonant and dissonant. This is pre-perception. But then there's musical consonance and dissonance, which is a cultural piece of this. So I'll play an example where, for me, the aesthetic piece of this, the cognitive aesthetic piece of this, is seeing a fragmented piece of music that has imbued dissonance come out of a fog and turn into a recognizable melody. So this is for string quartet. The time that it takes to arrive to the emergence of the melody by fragmenting and by dissonating and by building this set of expectations and There will be another one, there won't be another one. It's sort of a game that I'm playing as a composer to build a context. And I think that semi-conscious process in composition and the way a performer will then interpret it and say, how much time should I take with this? How much should I come out? I think that those are key factors in the concept of aesthetics in Western music.
Music reflects how the mind works. Temporal sequences, building expectations, affective or emotional responses. All of this is happening, of course, in the brain. And the brain, of course, is the substrate where art is created and appreciated and where transcendence is generated or perceived. But while there's a vast literature connecting mind and brain, what is the neuroscience of art and transcendence? I speak with the director of the Penn Center for Neuroaesthetics, a clinical neurologist and cognitive neuroscientist, Anjan Chatterjee.
Knowing something about the properties of the brain, how the properties interacts with the environment, how it constructs the environment, are all part of the remit of cognitive neuroscience. Within that, if you say that art making and art consuming, appreciating is a core human value, the impulse, the decorative impulse, you can go back 80,000, 100,000 years, you find beads that were around, musical instruments from bones that clearly had more than just their functional uses. And so this is built into our brains. It is built into our brains even if the nature of the art has changed tremendously over the years. So for a cognitive neuroscientist, we're still trying to understand what are those core things about the brain that makes us want to produce art, appreciate art, and how does that interact with culture, where the content of art seems to change every decade now, it seems.
The criticism that you might have heard is that if you subject art to the scientific reductionist way of thinking, you will get a lot of data, but you will leach out the fundamental essence of the phenomenology.
It's a criticism that we hear a lot, and sometimes I think it's fair. My own view is understanding of phenomena does not bleach out the magic of the phenomena, that you get a richer and richer experience of it. But having said that, this is a particular domain that lends itself to interdisciplinary work. For example, in my lab, I have an artist in resident, I have a senior art historian who comes, an anthropologist, I have a moral philosopher coming. And I think our cognitive neuroscience is made better and more informed by having all of this input into what we're doing.
And that sounds great, but how does it operationalize? I mean, you do fMRI studies, you do very sophisticated analysis, so how is an art historian or a moral philosopher going to facilitate that work?
I think the way they help us is in asking the right question. The more convergence we can get from other domains that says, this is worth going after, I think that informs our research agenda.
Mind, art, transcendence, each its own world. Mind, all cognition and emotion. Art, all creative expressions. Transcendence, all experiences beyond the self. While art via mind helps unveil transcendence, my hypothesis is to unify the three in a circular explanatory system. Mind creates or appreciates art. Art elicits or engenders transcendence. Transcendence probes and reveals mind. Larger questions of life are a kind of transcendence. The most physical constructions, buildings, can impart the most transcendental experiences. Transcendence can touch deep realities or be mental illusions. mind, art, transcendence interpenetrate, expressing the one reality. Music is an abstract and temporal art, reflecting the underlying brain. Knowing the neuroscience of art enables a richer, thicker appreciation of art's phenomenology. If materialism is true, and the mind is solely the brain, then for sure, art can help reveal its complex mechanisms. If materialism is not true, and the mind is more than the brain, then perhaps art can help reveal the deeper realities. Either one can bring us closer to truth.
For complete interviews and for further information, please visit closertotruth.com.